or good afternoon, or whenever you're watching this. My name is Randall Halle. I'm the director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh, Halle, EU Center of Excellence. And I welcome you to our December engagement. I'm a month ahead of myself. Our December engagement with our conversations on Europe. This panel in particular is focused on the economics of climate response. We, in the course of this series this semester, have looked at the history and the party political orientation of climate response in Europe. And now we're going to actually be thinking more specifically about the economics as we face a major question of how we transition into a more sustainable future for us. There have been goals set up that should make that possible, but those goals are variously being met or not being met, faster or slower. And we have a set of experts here today to help us really think that through. Before I begin, however, I really want to express my gratitude to our funders, including the Erasmus Plus program, which and the U.S. Department of Education's Title VI program, which both provide funding for our center and for the series, and the organizational genius of Ingrid Gomez-O'Toole, who makes everything happen here at the center. Without her, I don't know where we would be. So let's begin our discussion. And what we'll do is we have three panelists today. I will introduce each of them, giving each of them, after their introduction, an opportunity to set forward and offer some insights from out of their own backgrounds. For those of you who are participating in the audience in the webinar, you are welcome to pose your questions in the Q&A, and we'll draw them into the conversation. Make yourself known in the Q&A, and we'll bring those questions in, okay? And we welcome your participation. So my first panelist that I'd like to introduce is Phoebe Koundouri. Phoebe is, we're really lucky to have Phoebe here. We're lucky to have everybody here. We're lucky very much that Phoebe has agreed. She's the professor in economics at Athens University of Economics and Business, and also a research professor at the Technical University of Denmark. She is also currently, or since 2019, if I'm not mistaken, the president of the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. Professor Koundouri is very, very well known as a pioneer in innovative human-centric interdisciplinary systems for the sustainable interaction between nature, society, and the economy. Has published significant books. At this time, it may or may not only be 18, and has participated in hundreds of papers analyzing and predicting and organizing our climate response. So, Phoebe, if I may, we're delighted to have a contribution here. And behind that, you've also been working, if I'm not mistaken, you were at the recent COP, or you certainly attend, yes. if not in person, from far, but you've been very much engaged in the UN process and also the EU process. And yes. To remind us all, we're in a mode of transition from the Green Deal of Ursula von der Leyen's Commission 1 into a new mode of thinking about sustainability approach. And yes, you already have slides prepared, and I'll just turn it over to you to see if you can help us with your assessment of the Green Deal in this moment of transition that we're in.
Yes, so thank you very much for having me. I'm sure this will be a very interesting conversation, especially looking at the panelists, but also your own students. I lead this Alliance of Excellence for Research and Innovation of IFORIA that brings together the different institutions, accelerators, science policy networks, and scientific associations that I chair or direct. So this is an alliance that brings together research and innovation acceleration, science policy networks, and associations of scientists that aspire to create science-based and stakeholder co-design sustainability transformation pathways. Our thematics, and within them we have projects in 120 countries, interdisciplinary projects with many partners, competitively funded, focus on sustainable finance, environmental social governance, and sustainable development goals measurement, climate neutrality and resilience pathways, sustainable blue economy pathways, land use and water, food, energy nexus, pathways towards sustainable management of these systems, and also innovation, acceleration, education, upskilling, and reskilling. Now, with regards to the European Green Deal, I perceive the European Green Deal as one of the best, if not the best, transposition of the SDGs into a policy framework. So since the launch of the European Green Deal, late December 2019, we had 150 laws and regulations and initiatives voted for at the European level and then transposed into into national laws. And all of these laws are connected to one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the global agenda in terms of 163 countries that have signed this agenda is September 2015. Basically is composed of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 4 of them about the environmental systems, 8 of them about social systems, 4 an additional 4 on economic systems, and then the last goal, SDG 17, that has to do with the collaboration for the implementation of the goals. Now, every year, SDSN, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a global network, the biggest that exists under the auspices of the General Secretary of the UN and led by Columbia University, publishes this report that measures the level of implementation of each of the 17 SDGs and the 169 with targets within the 17 SDGs. And for these reports, we use about 300 indicators, and it's obvious that we are lagging seriously behind. You can see the graph on the right-hand side of my screen. We really need to change the pace of implementation in order to reach the goals. And red means we are lagging behind in terms of implementation, more than 50% behind, and green means we have achieved the goal. Here you can see the picture for the level of achievement of the ecosystems, environmental ecosystems. That is, the first graph is about food system, the second one is about climate systems, the third one is about land use systems, the fourth one is about marine use systems, and the fifth one is about water systems. I co-authored the SDSN report on Europe. Europe is more advanced, and this is partly the result of the detailed policies and regulations and institutional structured requirements within the European Green Deal. But yet again, if you look at the ecosystems, the climate system, SDG 13, the marine system, SDG 14, the land use system, SDG 15, the food system, SDG 2, they are all in the red, meaning lacking seriously behind the achievement of the goals. And then we can downscale at national level. We have, as I told you, many indices. Everything is open access, the data, the indices, the calculations, the predictions, because we also have predictions to 2030. And we can downscale even further to subnational level. And all these, and we can even downscale to the institutional and company level. So all this provides you a measurement of where we are. And then what you need to do in order to make progress is to transpose these 17 goals and 169 targets into a very articulate, detailed policy framework in order to foster implementation of the change, of the transition of the SDGs. And this is what we try to do in the European Green Deal. We have 4 major axes: the climate neutrality, protection of human life, animals, and planet. From pollution, clean tech leadership for European companies and leaving no one behind. And we had 1 trillion to support this, 700 billion from EU budget and another 25 billion from ETS, and the rest to be leveraged by investment processes. And of course, we all know that after we announced the European Green Deal, we had COVID, but yet again, it was a European policy decision to recover from COVID within the framework of the European Green Deal. And that was huge because this was a major nonlinearity that could be a major drawback to the implementation of the European Green Deal. So we insisted with the European Green Deal and financed with an additional 750 billion additional to the 1 trillion, the main areas of the Green Deal, which represent the main areas of the green and digital transition, decarbonizing power, circular economy, restoring biodiversity, e-mobility, and as far as digitalization, improving cybersecurity, deploying cutting-edge technologies, helping citizens develop digital skills and improve connectivity. And then we had various laws, the climate law, the first time that the commitment to 2015 neutrality and 2030 Fit for 55, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 55% compared to the 99 levels of emission. We had the EU taxonomy, which is a financing taxonomy that makes explicit the investments that are considered sustainable and allows access to cheap funding, low interest rates, long time horizons for projects that are within climate adaptation and mitigation, protection of water and marine resources, circular economy, pollution control, and ecosystem protections. And within that, we have the European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that now obliges big companies and regulated companies to report according to environmental, social, and governance criteria. And in this respect, we are experiencing a revolution in the financial and business world. Then we have the Fit for 55, 13 different regulations that update, revise, refine all of our regulations with regards to ETS, to transport, to land use, forests, agricultural ecosystems, and also creating a social green fund, proposing the carbon adjustment mechanism, and so on. Throughout this vivid acceleration of policies, regulations, and initiatives, we also had the digital policies and the industrial policies of the European Green Deal be connected with what we do. So we've done an AI analysis, and I'm going to close in 2 minutes, in order to investigate the connection between the European Green Deal and the SDGs. And this is an analysis that used deep neural networks and categorizes SDGs in transformations. The European Green Deal is very well equipped to support the transformations that are relevant to energy decarbonization and sustainable industry, to sustainable food, land, water, and oceans. Less efficient, but quite some effort have been devoted to that with respect to European Green Deal regulations on elements of the SDGs that are relevant to sustainable cities and communities and digital transformations. But the European Green Deal is weak compared to the SDG framework and demands with regards to the social cohesion elements of the transition, education, gender equality, income equality, health, well-being, and demography. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that the European Green Deal is not interested or does not have regulations for the just transition. Is that the amount of regulations and law on that is not as strong as the regulations on the green and digital transformation. With regards to the latest developments, in September, we had the Summit for the Future, which focused on sustainable development, peace, control for new technologies, empowerment of young people and future generations, and the need to reform UN architecture in order to support the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, but also the implementation of human rights and pioneering the need for peace around the world, given the tensions in the geopolitical system. And with regards to the latest COP, I should say that I've participated in more than 20 COPs. This year, I had more than 25 speeches and presentations at the COP. It was a COP that was not very vibrant, but some things were achieved. There was an agreement for global carbon markets, which is huge. It's very important to have global carbon markets, otherwise we cannot achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius. Of course, we've gone beyond the 1.5, but we hope that with carbon capture, we are going to be able to revert. There was an agreement on the adaptation in terms of the loss and damage fund for $300 billion a year from developed to developing countries. Next February, we have the new NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. So UK came with ambitious goals, and we try to keep the momentum for ambitious goals there. It's obvious now, that the focus is on technology, energy, transport, and heavy industry, technological innovation, the hard-to-abate sectors, aviation and shipping, of course, very important. And lastly, this was the finance COP. When we are saying in the finance COP, we mean that it is important to focus on the question, who is going to finance the transition, and how is this financing the transition going to care and support for the vulnerable, so that those that cannot pay for the transition, how we mitigate the regressive effect on the vulnerable populations. I lead the Global Climate Hub of the SDSN. I'm finishing in 1 minute. So we have a very holistic approach. So the answer to this question is that in order to be able to answer who is going to finance, first we have to derive the pathways. The pathways are the optimal mixture of technologies, policies, fiscal and financial instruments that we get us from where we are. And where we are is defined by our quantification of implementation of the SDGs and the European Green Deal policies. And this has to be made explicit and quantified and continuously assessed and monitored. Our goals are the ones that have been set at the SDG level, UN Agenda 2030, and then transpose into regional and national policies. And then we integrate climate systems, energy and transport systems, land use and marine systems, health systems, innovation systems, and embed the integrated transition pathways into socioeconomic systems. And not only develop the mathematical modeling, but co-design the solution pathways based on mathematical modeling, but also embracing the opinions, preferences, visions, worries of the stakeholders using transformative participatory approaches. So at the end of the day, we have an infrastructure that collects the data, runs the models, and creates the recommendations for the transformation for each and every country, through facilitation of engagement of stakeholders via decision support tools, visualizations, via virtual reality, digital twins, and so on. And in terms of the big question of how you finance for the implementation, well, we do a lot of economic analysis on different aspects of the transition and integrating the economic externalities. But one big thing is, first, if you have the fiscal space, if you are in a developed country, it is important to have general equilibrium analysis and identify how the income of the implementation of climate policies and other sustainability policies can be used to support the vulnerable. And we showcase different packages of measures that allows implementation of sustainability policies and at the same time increase growth rates, lower equity, higher equality, and higher number of jobs, job creations. If you are in a country where you don't have the fiscal space, then it's more difficult. And this is what we worked on as G21 now. I'm an advisor to G21 and the UN on this issue, which is how you create SDG stimulus for the developed world. How do you create multilateral financial system that can provide low-cost loans, long-run loans that will allow the developing world to actually invest in SDG stimulus where the fiscal space is non-existent. And the final thing that I want to note is that is based on another report that we've also presented at the COP, which showcases that even in Europe, we don't have the skills that are required in order to implement the European Green Deal. So this report is again based on AI. We created basically, we tried to answer two questions. The first questions based on the 150 laws that that are part of the European Green Deal, what are the skills and occupations that are needed in order to implement that. And we detailed all the skills and we created the new occupations that are needed. And then we asked the question, how much of these skills and occupations are already in the labor market of Europe as a whole? And the answer is 85% of the jobs and skills that we need are missing. So this calls for a major wave of investment on upskilling and reskilling and revising curriculars within schools and universities. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
That was an amazing overview and introduction to many questions that we can pursue. I think actually the focus that you just had, though, on the vulnerable is something that makes an easy transition to Max, who I'll introduce in a second. But the overview that you provided fundamentally shows us the way that this question of climate response has its European, national, and regional components, but that those are immediately intersecting with international, transnational, global aspirations. And there's a whole set of negotiations that are going on here. One thing, after we go the round, I would be interested in perhaps all of us thinking about what the political will does as an influence on the approaches that we're thinking about, and Phoebe, the models that you put forward. If the Commission or the national models change, do the goals themselves change, especially from the perspective of the United States, where the Trump government that's coming in is going to be filled with people who are climate deniers. It's an interesting question for us to be taking up. But first, let me turn to Max. It's hard for me not to say Max Koch, but Max Koch is professor of social policy and sustainability at the University of Lund, where he works precisely in the areas of sustainable welfare and degrowth, and many other things in his own research. But it was those that were particularly of interest to me. And Max is in the middle now of a post-growth welfare systems research project, and has just finished Sustainable Welfare for a New Generation of Social Policy. These are projects that are both Swedish in orientation, but then well beyond the borders of Sweden, if I'm not mistaken. He himself has traveled extensively, has been a visiting scholar guest professor in Madrid, in Rotterdam, in Cologne, in Edinburgh, and worked in particular in Potsdam at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. He's co-author, co-editor of numerous books, including The Deep Transformations, A Theory of Degrowth and Post-Growth and Well-Being Challenges to Sustainable Welfare. And Max, I'm going to ask you for your reflections here in a similar way. The conditions that you see the EU, especially as we're moving into the next von der Leyen Commission. But one of the things that intrigues me about your questions about welfare and sustainability and degrowth is that part of what we experienced with the European Green Deal is a form of backlash that has a lot to do with both in the agricultural sector, but in other sectors, concern about pocketbook issues, about individual positions within the economy that is unfolding in front of us. And the news from Germany right now with the anxiety over the auto industry, but that's not just a German concern. That suggests that broad parts of our industrial sector in Europe are going to be falling away. We could say the same thing here in North America. And it requires then perhaps this sort of vision of what are the other possibilities? And I've benefited greatly from hearing your paper at the Council for European Studies. Max was also recognized by the Journal for Common Market Studies as having provided us this last year with one of the outstanding essays that was presented then to us in Lyon, in which you were thinking differently about GDP and about different kind of factors for assessing economic welfare, as it were. So I'm going to start introducing you and open it up and see if you could help us move in a further direction here.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, thanks for a very nice introduction. Thanks, Phoebe, for your introduction too. And thanks for mentioning this lecture I gave in Lyon earlier in the year where we met. I just did these revisions I wanted before they published this paper, which is going to be called Europe in the Post-Growth Era Towards a Sustainable Welfare Deal, which tries to summarize a lot of the things that I can only sketch here now. The point of departure for this thinking about a new era where we kind of dethrone economic growth and try to replace it with other parameters is, the perception that we are in a multiple crisis. I think you said that in your first introduction, and Phoebe also referred to it. Well, there is, of course, first the environmental crisis, of which climate change is the most known dimension, but not the only one. But if we just keep to climate change, just today, I read from Professor Anderson from Manchester that the global carbon budget is going to be empty in 4 years from now. That means in 4 years, if 4 years, given that we more or less have the same emission as in 2024, after that, the 1.5 degree goal to which most countries have signed up in Paris cannot longer be obtained. And for the 2.0 degrees, we have something like maybe 10 years. So we need rather drastic changes, but that is only the first major crisis that I see Europe is in. The second one is the crisis of social inequality, about which experts like the French economist Piketty has reached levels that, well, he likens to the 19th century, and it was last seen then. And I will not talk so much about the two other dimensions of crisis that I do not treat so detailedly in the paper, but I will mention them anyway. So one is that people like political scientists often refer to as post-democracy, where there's maybe the recent American elections is a bit of a symptom of that. And not only there, we have actually a range of inroads from right-wing political parties, right in the center of Europe too, of course. It is not by far not an American phenomenon. Where experts on democracy question the impact that big capital has, billionaires spending, billionaires buying major platforms like Twitter and tweeting elections and in the way they wanted. So this is something that experts also discuss, that our democracy itself, representative democracy, is in a crisis, and what we should be doing, what we could be doing about it. And finally, I'd like to mention the ideological crisis, which is going back at least 30 years. In my Lyon paper, I was going back to Pierre Bourdieu's warning of the Modell Tietmeyer, which he issued in the early 1990s in the German weekly Die Zeit. Tietmeyer was at the time, the early 1990s, the head of the German Bundesbank and demanded the application of the neoliberal perspective to basically all economic, political, educational systems in Europe as a precondition, basically, to further European integration. And my hunch is that, unfortunately, Bourdieu's and others' warnings were not listened enough to, so that we have also a problem that many of the leaders that we have basically grew up in the neoliberal era and have no other answers at their in their arsenal of answers, policy tools, etc., that itself have to do with neoclassic economy and the celebrated market solution for about any problem that you can think, including climate change. A market for a commodity that has actually no use value, and where the market has to be kind of introduced artificially. Well, I comment on the one hand, if I just talk a little bit about the environmental crisis, which I think is I comment, of course, many of the goals of the European Green Deal in case of climate change. They are quite ambitious, and of course I'm all for it. But I question whether its combination with economic growth will leave it possible actually to meet these targets. So there is no credible evidence for an absolute decoupling of GDP growth from environmental resource parameters. It looks a little bit better for carbon emissions, but if you also look at other natural resources, then the evidence means that, and all the comparative studies basically say that you had absolute decoupling. Those absolute decoupling, for those who don't understand that expression, means that GDP growth rises at the same time environmental resource parameters shrink, and they would need to shrink very, very drastically and significantly to meet most of the SDGs and especially the climate targets. But I just want to repeat that my colleagues from Stockholm report about planetary boundaries. That 6 of 9 planetary boundaries have already been transgressed. So we need significant changes at the moment, and not only a gradual one. Perhaps if we had started this 50 years ago, and we had followed up on this, we hadn't arrived in the climate emergency that we are in now. And of course, if we talk about the climate emergency and Europe, we cannot be silent about our colonial past with European now. No, we have been historically emitting most of the carbon and the other greenhouse gases, which is we have a particular responsibility to decrease them, especially quick. And this cannot be done with the celebrated digitalization, which is very central in the European Green Deal, because this would require the increase in the use of non-metallic minerals such as lithium, cobalt, neodymium, nickel by between 200 and 1,500% by 2050. And these rare earth elements are very often found in the global south countries, which would need to be exported, and they are currently extracted very often under socially questionable conditions. That means extra exploitations, and quite often the environmental standards in these countries do not reach to what we would like to see for Europe either. So we must be very careful that the European Green Deal basically does not initiate a new type of colonial exploitation. So I would like to see us discussing Europe's answer basically as answering to three things at the same time, at least. Yeah, that is the climate and environmental crisis, that's the colonial heritage, and that third, the crisis of social inequality. And given, and I keep this short for now, maybe I can come back to this in the second round, and given the absence for basically absolute decoupling from GDP growth from environmental resource parameters, I can only suggest that we open our minds for imagining, and in Europe, where we do not see economic growth at the overall economic parameters. No? So Ursula von der Leyen is very proud in basically selling the European Green Deal as a green growth strategy. But we have had green growth for at least 30 years, and look where this has brought us. It's time to try something new. And then, of course, we have worked a lot on how, for example, how welfare systems might work in the absence of economic growth. And I am really the last person who says, because I'm a sociologist and I have studied this for 10 years at least, I'm the last person who says that a transition towards a post-growth era is a walk in the park. I thought I will leave that there, but I can only encourage people to open for this possibility and understand how this may work. So I see a lot of potential for basically at the same time addressing the crisis of inequality, climate, and giving a meaningful answer to the colonial legacy of Europe by starting the post-growth era. Thanks.
And indeed, the question of GDP and the question of technology, the presence of skills and the presence of limits, planetary limits, is something that's pointed to, and it'll be interesting to see as we go into the next round how we can take up these questions a little bit more. But certainly within Europe. Again, I would recall the way that the elections in the recent rounds that have gone through Europe have been transforming the political space and have, in many ways, been a kind of discussion vis-a-vis the green parties and sustainable agendas that were coming into the national levels, as Phoebe was charting out for us, and pushback there. That was important. But along with that, because we are talking about a globally integrated question, the relationship between Europe and, in effect, the transatlantic relationship, the relationship to the United States, also plays an important factor here. Phoebe already pointed out to us that within the Green Deal, the COVID response was set within the Green Deal and its parameters. And in many ways, the United States went through something that was very similar. And I'm saying this because it actually led, however, the Build Back Better and the COVID response initiatives in the United States actually led to a situation where there were anxieties about the transatlantic economic relationships. And was the United States subsidizing? Was it subsidizing solar in a way that was detrimental to the European industries, et cetera, et cetera? And for that, perhaps justly or unjustly, I was influenced by our next speaker and her thinking about this in articles that she's written. I'd like to introduce Masa Ocvirk. who is I hope I'm getting the C there in the name well enough to be approximate with respect, who is program coordinator for the Global Europe program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She is originally from Slovenia and has served as representative of the Slovenian National Assembly to the European Parliament. Brussels, has been embedded, as it were, in these kinds of processes directly and has been thinking about this. She has worked as an advisor for committees on the EU affairs and foreign policy and has been herself very, very attentive to transatlantic relations. And indeed, I appreciate the idea of global Europe, because here at our center, we often approach it as a question of Europe in the world, that Europe itself is restricted to a continental set of boundaries, but the kind of interlacing of relations. And Max has already expressed to us that some of these are coming out of the colonial context, others are in very different contexts. I would happily go on and praise Maša, but I would welcome your reflections here, kind of reflection on what you've heard so far, but also help us think about this, the way that Europe is being positioned within the world. Because now, as we move into the second term in office, already the question was the potential that it might have for devastating both the European and the U.S. Economic dynamic. We just heard Max suggesting that maybe we need a very different economic dynamic at play. Maybe disruption is going to result in that. But much of this has already had an impact on the kinds of technological potentials that Phoebe and even Max were identifying as being offered as solutions for climate response. And so I'm going to stop and see and turn it over to you and listen attentively.
Yes, thank you, Randall. Thank you for having me here, and thank you to my to the speakers before me. I think they gave really good points for me to go off of, and then, of course, Phoebe also gave an excellent overview of, as she rightly put it, the vivid acceleration of the climate goals and the green policies we've witnessed in the European Union, I would say, since 2019. And looking at this great overview of over 150 policies, I think you can really kind of appreciate or understand when Ursula von der Leyen back in 2019 said or described this moment of the introducing the European Green Deal as Europe's man on the moon moment. I think since then, of course, a lot of things have happened. Both speakers have addressed the various crises, or the state of polycrisis, as some would describe it, in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. I would also put here as well the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the decoupling of Europe's decoupling from Russian energy, that also played a significant role in terms of how people perceived the efforts and the climate policies and goals that Europe was pursuing at that time. And I think what I wanted to address here, and looking at the fact that the European Commission started its work the week before, so on 1st of December, I was kind of trying to focus a bit on this kind of new approach that we see, which also has been raising a lot of questions if the EU or Europe still has a European Green Deal, because we now have this dilemma between green versus clean. We see a lot of new initiatives coming up forth are phrased as clean and not so much as green. And have to be upfront that listening to Max's arguments of the Europe's answer needs to be focused on climate, social inequality, and colonialism. Unfortunately, in the Commission's priorities, I see that as being kind of back on the sidetrack. I see more the European Commission or the new priorities really hands-on focusing on the competitiveness, which is a result of what you mentioned at the beginning, the transatlantic tensions we have seen, or the different transatlantic approaches to the crises we have seen in the past. So I think what has been, I think, a really intense promulgator of all of this from the EU side has, of course, been not only the recognition of a global competition, let's put it like that, in terms of clean technologies and innovation, but looking at Chinese practices in terms of market distortion, but at the same time also the United States and the Build Back Act, and then also the IRA, so the Inflation Reduction Act that was kind of very surprising to the Europeans when that was passed, and then kind of very swiftly was followed by a European response, which was the European Green Industrial Act, focusing exactly on the similar measures, on a similar approach of creating more supportive environment for scaling up EU's manufacturing capacity for net zero technologies. And this is what I want to point out in my contribution, is that we've seen now with the new European Commission, while we have the European Green Deal and the targets are still there and the implementation is working, we do see this change in the narrative that the green transition is not only now there for the environmental reasons, for social reasons, but also, if not even more, for economic reasons. And unfortunately, I guess to Max's disappointment, to spur growth in Europe and to be competitive to China and the US. And this was, most clearly, and I think all of you probably noticed, most clearly stated also with the recent competitiveness report done by Mario Draghi that puts this decarbonization efforts at its core and claims that all these climate policies have these substantial industrial opportunities for Europe, and that decarbonization is basically an opportunity in three ways. So one is to achieve the climate goals. One is to significantly reduce energy prices, which have been affecting EU's competitiveness, and also to compete with China and the US in terms of innovation in clean technologies. So looking at all of that, what's in store for the next commission, as it's now shaping up its response? As I've said at the beginning, there was a lot of criticism at the start that there was a lack of attention towards concrete climate goals. While I do see that, as I've pointed out, the narrative has significantly changed, the climate targets or the climate goals are still there. Whether these will be reached, that is a different question, but the climate goals are still there. As far as I understand, there's also a new ambition to enshrine the 90% emission reduction target into the European climate law. But on that note, this does not disregard, on the other hand, the fact that there are active attempts to backtrack on some climate legislation. And here I can already go a bit to the political aspect that you were, Randall, talking about before. We see the current dynamics in terms of the European Parliament, but also in terms of the Council, have resulted in quite a bit of resistance when it comes to new climate proposals, new climate goals. We see what was happening around the Nature Restoration Act or the deforestation law just recently, and also the open discussion now to kind of backtrack on the ban on the sale of combustion engine cars, which was a significant act and part of the Europe's Green Deal. So like I said, in my view, the whole mantra of the new European Commission is basically focusing on the competitiveness, which this change in narrative kind of corresponds to trying to address the concerns of the electorate and of the business stakeholders, which, as we saw before the European Parliament election, and this is one of the articles I wrote with the farmers' protests, there was a significant backlash of the interests of citizens, interests of businesses not being taken into account when it comes to this transition. While I don't agree with this, there is clearly some issues in terms of strategic communication when it comes to climate goals and how these measures benefit regular citizens when it comes to that. And I will quickly end on this, and this is also something that I would actually be curious, especially to hear from maybe Max, who works on the welfare issues, is we see a lot of this focus now on the competitiveness and the criticism of the European Green Deal, as how I would put it, has been twofold. So lack of attention to what businesses need, but also lack of attention to what citizens need and this whole just transition. But as I'm seeing it now, for instance, this whole new focus is to really spur competitiveness and focus on the businesses. But the open question is then, and it's kind of also coming from my disappointment here, is that how do we make sure that all this investment that potentially, as Mario Draghi has been saying, is worth 800 billion a year of investment is needed? How will Europe make sure that this also benefits workers and citizens more broadly? This is something I see still very much lacking in the new political guidelines.
Thank you. Yes, move from Green Deal to Clean Deal. That's perhaps something that we can take. But it's also the case, one of the remarkable things about the farmers and the farmers' transition that you're pointing to is the way, in effect, that the 2018 elections, the green electoral wave that took place there was also driven in many ways by agricultural interests and drove things like the reforestation, rewilding initiatives, which are now then also the crux of a shift in the farmers who are voting quite differently at this point in time. And it's perhaps an interesting question if that was only a matter of communication, but it has really had a dramatic impact on the electorate, the citizens' relationship to the project when it comes down to it. So we have a number of things that are on the table, and I'd be happy to open it up and also remind the people in the audience that you're welcome to pose a question at any time. So we'll be monitoring the Q&A to make sure. But I would return it perhaps to us collectively and pose this question then about what Maša, pointing back to Phoebe, this question of acceleration. And Phoebe charted out for us over 150 laws that are sort of in the process of taking effect. But yet there seems to be certain kind of limits that Max has charted out for us in terms of, in effect, what the planet itself can sustain. And Phoebe, I'm wondering if you might have a response to this nexus of both time it takes for the response to hit, the potential acceleration, an increase in technological response, the possibility of climate response getting cheaper, as it were, and at the same time the planetary limits that we're confronting, because you are also showing us that we're lagging behind in where we need to be. Could you?
We are definitely lagging behind. We definitely integrate in our policy framework and the transposition of this framework into implementable strategies, planetary limits, and well-defined planetary limits, because it's not enough to say these are the planetary limits. In the SDGs and in European Green Deal regulations, you have the explicit need to detail what you expect to be the collapse of the ecosystem's resilience. So at that point where you have irreversible collapse of ecosystems, that's the point that you have you are reaching planetary boundaries. And of course, we are facing the climate crisis, the ecosystem collapse crisis, increasing inequalities between the global north and the global south, increasing inequalities within countries, and at the same time, almost 1/3 of the countries in the world at the brink of default or are default, with fiscal spaces dangerously shrinking, not just in the developing world, but also in the developed world, and also facing low growth rates all over the world, in developing countries as well, and increasing inflationary pressures. So it's a mixture of economic and environmental crises that need integrated understanding and modeling in order to be addressed. And they can be addressed. And we have models and integrated models of the different systems, like I showed before, the land use systems, the energy systems, the transport systems, the socioeconomic systems. So for me, it's a integrated, interdisciplinary exercise that needs to be undertaken at different scales. And this is exactly what the Climate Hub is doing, from local scale to national to regional to international and back. What is important is the fact that the business case for transition to sustainability is now there, because renewable is cheaper than fossil fuel per unit on production, because circular economy produces lots of production economies and reduces the cost along the value chain of a company, because nature-based solutions can be quite productive, because digitalization, if used cleverly and efficiently, can also provide solutions. So we are at the moment in time that the business case for the sustainability transition is there. Our knowledge on how to handle non-linearities and irreversibilities in our modeling is there. Moreover, there is a lot of money around the world, especially in the private sector, that is looking for clever projects to invest on. So what is important for me is to uncover the wealth of possibilities in this green and digital transition, especially in the areas of renewables, alternative fuels, circular economy, hydrogen, all these different technologies that are there. They are, some of them mature enough and cost efficient, some of them with a lot of potential. We also have carbon capture and storage that could provide a solution to our above the limit current status, above the 1.5 degrees. This is a very difficult challenge. I'm not saying that it's easy, but it's easier today than at any point in our history, in our contemporary history. And in addition to this, it's not just the case that we have most of the technology that we need. It's not just the case that we have money The money is there waiting to be invested if we make clever public-private partnerships. We are also facing the situation where we are living with the huge effects of ecosystem collapse and climate crisis. So it's not like when I started my career 30 years ago that I had to convince that along the road in 25 years, 30 years, we're gonna facing such a frequency and severity of extreme weather events that we have to invest now to avoid them. At this point in time, we are experiencing the losses in the billions and trillions every year and human lives because of floods, of forest fires, of heat waves, of tsunamis, and so on. And all these are intensified in frequency and severity because of climate change, and we know that. And at this point of time that we are experiencing the effects in the harshest possible way, we are also at a point that we have the technology and the business cases there. So for me, there is no way we are going to escape to get our economies and society on a pathway towards sustainability, meaning that socioeconomic system has to be it has to achieve economic efficiency, social cohesion, and at the same time respect ecosystem tipping points. And what's more, we know how to model, we know how to project, we know how to build the pathways towards that path. My only question mark is it's not whether we are going along the sustainable pathway, but whether we are gonna get on board fast enough before it's too late. So one of the critical variables that's going to define the pace of the transformation towards sustainability will be the existence of the skills and knowledge in the labor market to implement all these technologies and fiscal and financial and social instruments that will accelerate the transformation. And my major worry is that we are lacking in skills and knowledge. We are not lacking in technology. We are not lacking in money. We are not lacking in policies either. We are lacking in terms of the in-situ skills in the labor market, the people who are going to apply this within all the stakeholder groups. The politicians do not understand fully. The policymakers do not understand fully. The businessmen do not understand fully. The financial institutions do not understand fully. The civil society does not understand fully. So science has most of the answers. It's obvious that we have to transform. We are facing the effects. A lot of the technology for changing is there. A lot of the money ready to invest in this technology is there, but there is no capacity or implementation because the skills and knowledge are lacking. And they are lacking in Europe, and they are also lacking at a more intense degree in the global south. And that's why investments are not being made, not just because of geopolitical instability and economic uncertainty and ambiguity, deep uncertainty, but also because you don't have the skills in the labor market to actually make it happen. So I think we are not prioritizing enough the need for investing in upskilling and reskilling and revising curricula in universities and schools in a way that they can support interdisciplinary green and digital transition solutions. I'm not saying that if we have that, everything will be easy, but I'm saying that without that, nothing can be implemented.
I mean, I certainly appreciate that. I spent the first winter after the invasion of Ukraine in Europe, and the decoupling from Russian fuel was interesting because many people were looking for heat pumps or things, and you're talking about skills in all sorts of levels, but it was a very concrete experience. There were just not enough people trained to be able to install new systems of heating to meet the demand, as it were, in a very old supply. There was supply, there was demand, but there wasn't labor force at that moment to provide it. And we hear this in various capacities with the building of wind and solar installations. The people, and that's not only what you're talking about. You're talking about also skills at a researcher level, at a development level, and
also how you integrate ecosystem resilience with economic activities, these integrated approaches that are needed in order to have a holistic, a robust transformations of cities, of villages, of countries. The skills are not there because people are not trained in interdisciplinarity, in integrated systems, in holistic solutions. And this is what is needed in order to achieve economic, social, and ecosystems sustainability.
Can I bring Max into the conversation again? I think that there's a couple of things, Max, that are intriguing me. The way that also Maša pointed us to the question of competitiveness. And competitiveness is an interesting dynamic here, because competitiveness also meant, for instance, that the solar structures within Europe were somewhat devastated by cheap solar production in China. Right? And so competitiveness on a global scale also plays a role here in accelerating, but also decelerating. And I'm wondering, I'll just turn it to you for a second to get your reflections on what we're talking about. You're nodding about the skills question. These are not outside of post-growth or degrowth questions that you're posing, but whatever route we go forward in, we need people with skills. We need materials, and yet we have these other impediments to them. I'm wondering what you might add here.
Let me first apologize.
We're glad you're back.
My internet link was down for about 5 minutes, so I did not. Unfortunately, Phoebe, I did not hear everything you said. So if I misrepresent anything you said, that is probably down to the fact that I didn't get everything. But I just want to make one thing clear. There's actually no one in the post-growth camp, which is a broad church. I don't think I have time to kind of explain this in detail, but I drop at least a few. There's the well-being economy, the donut economy, a certain degrowth economists. Milena Büchs and we have kind of specialized a little bit in understanding how well-being may be maintained. We in Europe, we enjoy relatively high levels of well-being compared to other parts of the world. How this may be at least critical levels, or that may be maintained with a lower economic output. But that does not at all mean we are against innovation or things like that. But we are talking here not so much of outcompeting other companies, but we are talking about social innovations, and that may mean to kind of listen to people and go back to some more kind of traditional solutions that you had in certain local circumstances. We we suggest seeing the whole economic system and not so much as a spectacle of competition around financially measurable items, but more in see the economics as ecological economists do it, as something where you have a throughput of matter and energy, where entropy is being accelerated, and this is something which we would like to slow down. See the economy as something that, entropy as such is, of course, cannot be avoided, but we can impact on the speed with which we use up resources, and for that we think it is crucial to, on the one hand, think about social floors. That is basically that everyone in Europe and beyond, the whole world basically, and not only our present generation, but also those who come after us, should be able to satisfy their basic needs. And there are basically two major approaches now, one by Doyle and Guff and one by Max Neef. So they're not it's not an indefinite number of needs that we're talking about, but clear water, air to breathe, food to eat are, of course, parts of it. And that's one thing where welfare systems come into play. And there we see that the universal basic systems, where we have in the Nordic countries a certain tradition, have rather better results than market systems, privatized systems, as for example in the US. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that we have to talk about ecological ceilings. We have a situation where the needs satisfaction of the many is undermined by the luxury lifestyles of a small minority. And if you look at the research by Stefan Gößling here in the neighboring town of Växjö, he basically shows with rather simple mathematic terms that any climate goal that we are talking about cannot be met without significantly cutting the lifestyles of the top 1%. So we need also to talk about power. We've talked a lot about technological innovations, about technocratically combining this and that SDGs, but we are up against manifest material interest, which happen to also monopolize kind of the symbolic power that allows them to basically have the public perceive their particular interest as in their general interest. And these are things where we need, sociological knowledge. We need to understand how hegemony works, and we need to think about, questioning the common sense within which economic growth plays an important role. So we really need to take seriously the fact that we are in a crisis, just as in COVID. In COVID, the European and other world leaders came together and said, well, we have to now to make sure that people have something to eat, to drink, and that there and 10 other basic needs on that. And well, the climate emergency needs to be taken just as seriously. As I said in my initial statement, in 4 years, the carbon budget runs out, and we're talking here as if this is, one of the, discourses among many. I think that should take center stage, and everything else should be basically have a bit of a second order. Thanks.
Maybe Maša, we could bring you back in here and help us think about this further. You brought certain terms to the fore. I do want to say that I was myself in Europe during Merkel's move out of nuclear power. And I mention this in part because what it seemed to me at that point in time that Merkel was tacitly saying is that we're leaving behind a legacy industry, and we're positioning Germany and Europe in a way that it will be the leader in new forms of energy and bringing down energy costs. It will result in not just sustainability, but a kind of viability and innovation on that level. And that wasn't bound up within the categories of growth per se, but it was a kind of vision for an economy of the future that has gotten, as it started to unfold, met certain problems. And I think of that moment as a moment of hope. And that's not a question, it's an observation. But Maša, maybe you could comment on what you're hearing here as well.
Yeah, I fully agree that before, that moment, and I would say with the introduction of the European Green Deal, it was a kind of a moment of hope. And then, as I think we all pointed out, and then we had several crises that faced afterwards that kind of got us off track or distracted policymakers because it demanded, climate change, climate adaptability. These are all measures that take a lot of time in terms of having an impact and having results. When it came to, the coupling from Russian energy, that basically it was done overnight, the decision to stop using Russian energy, and Russia also stopped slowly decreasing its imports into the European Union. However, and at the same time, you had energy prices, skyrocketed. Basically, people were paying hundreds of dollars or euros in that case for their energy bills, and their measures in terms of someone that works on policy measures and as a politician, you needed concrete measures swiftly, which unfortunately meant that a lot of the focus was how to bring this energy, not necessarily green energy, but just sufficient energy, how to diversify so you would address these issues. And since then, we have seen, unfortunately, just this global market competition around all these issues intensifying more and more. At the same time, instead of having cooperation between, for instance, especially US and the EU, we are having the exact opposite effect, which potentially might even increase with the new administration. So unfortunately, we are at a stage where, while I see optimism with this new narrative of competitiveness, because it would, as people are perceiving it, help achieve decarbonization, because this is what would lead to competitiveness. I do think, and I think that was an excellent point by Phoebe, the not prioritizing the necessary skills and knowledge, which is something I kind of addressed, and Phoebe phrased it much better in the end. I think this is what's very much missing, not only in the EU, but also in the US. And this is something I can end on a positive note as something that I could see potentially, maybe not government level cooperation necessarily, but on a lower level in terms of like innovation and academic connections. When it comes to research, there is some opportunity to advance these necessary skills and knowledge.
I appreciate that. Actually, I'm looking at the clock, and I'm afraid that we're really our hour and a half has flown by. Ingrid, were there in the chat? There were no. That was you posting. Okay, but I would just signpost that in January, our next installment of the Conversations on Europe, we will be having our European Union Film Festival here, which is devoted to questions of sustainability. It is under the tagline "Climate Change, Hope, and Chickens." And we're really actually looking for not scenarios that are. We're looking to present scenarios that are hopeful, precisely, and stories of citizen initiatives work within the court systems, rewilding campaigns that have been successful, and finding really good and strong stories and storytelling coming out of Europe that does provide us with a sense that there may be a brighter future coming up very soon. I do think we've raised a number of the issues that are impeding that bright future. And I really appreciate Phoebe, Maša, the insights that you provided, and also helping. It is not necessarily the case that we're trying to say that Europe is better or the United States is better, but helping us understand what various options we're all confronting leads to us being able to speak better with each other and to each other. And you've certainly done your best to facilitate that today. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I appreciate it. I hope that we will continue to be in conversation.